In the year 539 BCE, the gates of Babylon swung open without a battle. The greatest city in Mesopotamia, protected by walls so massive they seemed to touch the sky, surrendered to a foreign king who entered not as a destroyer, but as a liberator. This was no ordinary conqueror. Cyrus of Persia had already shattered the armies of Media and Lydia, and now he stood at the threshold of creating something the ancient world had never seen. An empire that would stretch from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, encompassing a territory of over 5 million square kilometers and ruling nearly half the world's population. The Achaemenid Persian Empire wasn't just vast, it was revolutionary. In an age when conquered peoples expected slaughter and enslavement, the Persians offered something radical: tolerance. Where other empires demanded cultural submission, the Achaemenids allowed subject peoples to maintain their languages, religions, and customs. They built roads that connected civilizations, standardized currencies that facilitated trade across continents, and developed administrative systems so sophisticated that their innovations would echo through the Roman Empire, the Islamic caliphates, and into modernity itself. This is the story of how a confederation of Iranian nomadic tribes became the ancient world's first true superpower, and how that empire, at its zenith, fell to a 25-year-old Macedonian king who would change history forever. The Persians emerged from obscurity in the 7th century BCE, dwelling in the southwestern region of the Iranian plateau called Persis, modern-day Fars province. They were one among many Iranian peoples who had migrated into the region around 1000 BCE, settling alongside the ancient Elamites and eventually coalescing into tribal confederations. For generations, they lived as vassals to the Medes, a more powerful Iranian group that had helped overthrow the Assyrian Empire. The royal house claimed descent from a semi-legendary figure named Achaemenes, who supposedly ruled the small kingdom of Anshan. But it was Cyrus II, born around 600 BCE, who would transform this obscure lineage into a world-conquering dynasty. Later, Greek writers wrapped his origins in myth. Herodotus told of an abandoned infant raised by shepherds, destined to overthrow his grandfather. The reality was likely more prosaic, but no less remarkable. Cyrus inherited the throne of Anshan around 559 BCE as a vassal of the Median king Astyages. Within 6 years, Cyrus had ignited a rebellion that would reshape the ancient world. The catalyst came when Astyages, suspicious of his ambitious Persian vassal, sent an army commanded by the general Harpagus to crush the revolt. But Harpagus, who had his own grievances against the Median king, defected with his forces to Cyrus's side. The betrayal was devastating. At the Battle of Pasargadae in 550 BCE, the Median army dissolved as soldiers switched their allegiance to the Persian upstart. Astyages was captured, and in a single stroke, Cyrus became master of both the Persian and Median territories. What happened next revealed Cyrus's political genius. Rather than executing his defeated enemy or razing the Median capital, he treated Astyages with respect and elevated Median nobles to high positions in his new administration. He presented himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a legitimate successor to the Median throne, possibly even claiming Median royal blood through his mother. This policy of reconciliation, rather than subjugation, would become the hallmark of Achaemenid rule. With the Median territory secured, Cyrus inherited a loosely organized collection of vassal states: Armenia, Cappadocia, Parthia, and others. But his ambitions extended far beyond the Iranian plateau. To the west lay the wealthy kingdom of Lydia, ruled by Croesus, a king so rich his name became synonymous with wealth. When Croesus watched Persian power rise on his eastern border, he consulted the oracle at Delphi. Encouraged by this ambiguous prophecy, Croesus invaded in 547 BCE. The first battle proved indecisive, and the Lydian king retreated toward his capital at Sardis, expecting Cyrus to withdraw for the winter. Instead, the Persian king pursued relentlessly through the cold season. At the decisive Battle of Thymbra, Cyrus unveiled a tactical innovation that would pass into legend. Knowing that Lydian cavalry was superior to his own, he mounted his baggage camels with riders and placed them at the front of his battle line. The stench of the camels so unsettled the Lydian war horses that they bolted from the battlefield, leaving Croesus's infantry exposed and doomed. Sardis fell after a brief siege, and true to the oracle's words, a great empire was indeed destroyed, but it was Croesus's own. Cyrus demonstrated mercy again, sparing the Lydian king's life and incorporating Lydia's wealth and Greek subjects into his growing empire. The conquest brought Cyrus control of the Aegean coast and its prosperous Greek city-states, along with Lydia's vast treasury. But the jewel remained Babylon. In 539 BCE, Cyrus marched on the greatest city of Mesopotamia, where the aged king Nabonidus had alienated the powerful priesthood of Marduk through religious reforms. The Babylonian gates opened without resistance, and Cyrus entered the city not as a conqueror, but as a liberator. The famous Cyrus Cylinder, a clay document commissioned by the king, proclaimed his respect for Babylonian gods and his restoration of their temples. More significantly, it announced the release of peoples who had been held captive in Babylon, including the Jews, who had been exiled from Jerusalem decades earlier by Nebuchadnezzar. The Jewish sources, particularly the biblical Book of Ezra, record Cyrus's decree allowing the Jews to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple. The Persian king even funded the reconstruction from the royal treasury. It's no wonder that the Hebrew Bible calls Cyrus the Lord's anointed, the only foreign ruler ever granted such a title. This policy of religious tolerance wasn't mere benevolence, it was strategic brilliance. By respecting local customs and religions, Cyrus earned the loyalty of diverse peoples who might otherwise have rebelled against foreign rule. By the time of his death in 530 BCE, fighting nomadic tribes on the empire's northeastern frontier, Cyrus had created an empire that dwarfed anything the ancient world had previously known. But he had done more than conquer. He had invented a new model of empire, one that would prove both durable and transformative. Cyrus's son, Cambyses II, continued his father's expansionist policies by conquering Egypt in 525 BCE. The campaign was methodical and overwhelming. After defeating Pharaoh Psamtik III at the Battle of Pelusium, Cambyses secured Egypt's surrender and even pushed south into Nubia. But his reign ended in confusion. In 522 BCE, while Cambyses was campaigning in Egypt, news reached him that a usurper claiming to be his brother Bardia had seized the throne in Persia. Cambyses died mysteriously while rushing back to defend his crown, either from an infected wound, suicide, or assassination. The details remain murky. What followed was a crisis that nearly tore the young empire apart. A man named Darius, a distant relative of the royal line who had served as Cambyses's spear-bearer, claimed that the supposed Bardia was actually an impostor. A Magian priest named Gaumata, who had murdered the real Bardia and seized power through deception. Darius, along with 6 Persian nobles, assassinated the usurper and claimed the throne for himself. But claiming it and holding it proved to be different matters. The empire erupted in rebellion. Within months, Darius faced 19 separate revolts across the empire's territories. Babylon rebelled twice. Elam rose up. Media questioned his legitimacy. Margiana, Parthia, and other eastern provinces declared independence. For an entire year, Darius fought a brutal campaign to reunify the empire, personally leading armies from one end of his domains to the other, crushing each rebellion with methodical efficiency. The Behistun inscription, which Darius commissioned to be carved into a limestone cliff in western Iran, tells the story in dramatic detail. The massive relief, 15 meters high and 25 meters wide, shows Darius with his foot on the chest of a defeated enemy, with 9 rebel kings bound in chains before him. The text, written in 3 languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, proclaims Darius's divine right to rule and his triumph over chaos. It's both political propaganda and historical record, and it would later prove invaluable to scholars as the Rosetta Stone of cuneiform script. Having secured his throne through blood and determination, Darius turned to the monumental task of organizing his vast empire. What Cyrus had conquered through military genius, Darius would stabilize through administrative innovation. He reorganized the empire into approximately 20 satrapies, provinces governed by appointed officials called satraps. Each satrap functioned like a regional king, responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining order, administering justice, and raising troops when the empire called for war. But Darius understood that concentrating so much power in regional governors posed dangers. To prevent satraps from becoming too independent, he implemented a sophisticated system of checks and balances. Each satrapy had 3 key officials: the satrap himself, who handled civil administration; a military commander who controlled the garrison but reported independently to the king; and a royal secretary who kept official records and communicated directly with the central government. This division of authority ensured that no single individual could accumulate enough power to threaten the throne. Even more ingeniously, Darius created a corps of royal inspectors known as the eyes and ears of the king. These officials traveled constantly throughout the empire, conducting surprise audits of satrapies, investigating complaints, and reporting back to the king on the loyalty and efficiency of his governors. The mere existence of this inspection system helped maintain honesty and competence among provincial administrators who knew they could be scrutinized at any moment. To facilitate communication across the empire's vast distances, Darius expanded and formalized the royal road, which stretched nearly 1,600 miles from Sardis in Asia Minor to Susa in Persia. At intervals of approximately 15 miles, a day's ride for a horse, stood chaparkhane, postal stations where royal messengers could exchange exhausted mounts for fresh ones. This relay system meant that a message could travel from Sardis to Susa in just 7 days, a journey that would normally require 3 months on foot. Herodotus marveled at this achievement, writing that neither snow nor rain nor heat nor darkness of night prevents these couriers from completing their designated stages with utmost speed. Words that would centuries later be adapted as the motto of the United States Postal Service. Darius's reforms extended to the economic sphere. He introduced a standardized currency based on the gold daric and silver siglos, which facilitated trade throughout the empire. Previously, different regions had used various forms of payment. From Lydian coins to simple barter, the daric became the first truly international currency, accepted from the Mediterranean to India. Its widespread adoption stimulated commerce, making it easier for merchants to conduct business across imperial boundaries. The tax system underwent similar rationalization. Rather than irregular tribute demanded arbitrarily, Darius established fixed annual assessments for each satrapy based on its agricultural productivity and economic potential. Babylon, the empire's richest province, paid the highest assessment, 1,000 silver talents plus food supplies for the army for 4 months of the year. Egypt, the empire's breadbasket, owed 700 talents plus 120,000 measures of grain. This predictable tax structure allowed for imperial planning while preventing satraps from overtaxing their populations. Darius also recognized that effective administration required a common language for government business. While Old Persian remained the ceremonial language of the royal court, Darius promoted Imperial Aramaic as the empire's administrative lingua franca. Aramaic, already widely used for commerce throughout the Near East, became the language of official decrees, legal documents, and interprovincial correspondence. Scribes throughout the empire learned to write in Aramaic, creating a class of professional bureaucrats who could communicate efficiently across cultural and linguistic boundaries. The sophistication of this administrative system is evident in the Persepolis fortification tablets. More than 30,000 clay documents discovered in the 1930s. These administrative records, mostly written in Elamite, provide extraordinary insight into the daily operations of the empire, recording everything from rations distributed to workers, to travel authorizations for officials, to grain shipments between provinces. They reveal an empire that was meticulously organized, with detailed record-keeping and bureaucratic procedures that would not be matched in complexity until the Roman Empire. But Darius understood that an empire needed more than efficient administration. It needed symbols of power that could awe subjects and intimidate enemies. Around 518 BCE, he began construction of Persepolis, a new ceremonial capital that would embody the grandeur and diversity of the Achaemenid Empire. Built on a massive terrace carved from the mountainside in the heartland of Persis, Persepolis was never intended to house a large population or serve as the empire's administrative center. Instead, it functioned as a stage for royal ceremonies and the annual New Year festival of Nowruz, when subject peoples would bring tribute to the great king. The approach to Persepolis was designed to humble visitors. A grand double staircase led up to the Gate of All Nations, flanked by colossal statues of Lamassu, human-headed bulls that combined power with wisdom. Beyond lay the Apadana, an audience hall that could accommodate 10,000 people beneath a cedar roof supported by 72 columns rising 60 feet into the air. The columns were topped with elaborate capitals featuring paired animals: bulls, lions, eagles, symbols of royal authority drawn from the artistic traditions of multiple cultures. The walls of the Apadana were adorned with relief sculptures depicting representatives from the empire's subject peoples bringing tribute to the king: Ethiopians with ivory tusks, Indians with gold dust, Bactrians leading camels, Greeks carrying bolts of cloth. Each delegation was rendered with ethnographic precision, their distinctive clothing and physical features carefully preserved in stone. The message was unmistakable. The great king ruled a universal empire encompassing all the world's peoples, each contributing to the prosperity and glory of the center. The artistic style of Persepolis reflected the empire's multicultural character. Babylonian and Elamite craftsmen carved the reliefs, incorporating decorative motifs from their own traditions. Greek sculptors contributed techniques for rendering the human figure. Egyptian stonemasons brought their expertise in monumental architecture. The result was a synthesis, a distinctly Persian imperial art that drew upon multiple traditions without being wholly identified with any single one. The ideology underlying this artistic program was explicit. The great king ruled by divine mandate, chosen by Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of Zoroastrianism, to bring order to the world. Inscriptions throughout Persepolis proclaimed this divine sanction. Darius declared, "By the favor of Ahura Mazda, I am king. Ahura Mazda granted me the kingdom." This wasn't mere propaganda. It reflected a genuine religious worldview, in which the king served as the earthly agent of cosmic order, maintaining harmony among peoples and ensuring justice throughout his realm. Yet, Darius's religious policy remained pragmatic. While personally devoted to Ahura Mazda, he continued Cyrus's practice of religious tolerance, supporting local cults throughout the empire. In Egypt, he presented himself as a traditional pharaoh, patron of Egyptian gods. In Babylon, he honored Marduk and restored temples. This religious flexibility served the empire's interests by earning the loyalty of powerful priesthoods who might otherwise have fomented rebellion. The monumental architecture extended beyond Persepolis. At Susa, one of the empire's administrative capitals, Darius built a palace that rivaled Persepolis in splendor. At Ecbatana, the old Median capital that served as the empire's summer residence, Persian kings maintained elaborate gardens and hunting parks. The empire's wealth seemed inexhaustible, drawn from the tribute of dozens of subject peoples and the control of vital trade routes connecting east and west. But this appearance of invincibility would soon be tested by a coalition of small Greek city-states that refused to acknowledge Persian supremacy. The clash between Persia and Greece began not with armies, but with ambition. In 499 BCE, the Greek cities of Ionia, prosperous trading centers on the Aegean coast that had fallen under Persian control during Cyrus's conquest of Lydia, rose in revolt against their Persian overlords. The rebellion was led by Aristagoras, the tyrant of Miletus, who had suffered a humiliating defeat in an attempted conquest of Naxos backed by Persian support. Facing dismissal, Aristagoras instead chose to incite rebellion, calling on the Greek mainland cities to support Ionian independence. Athens and Eretria sent ships and soldiers to aid their Ionian kinsmen. The allied Greek forces marched inland and burned Sardis, the regional capital and former Lydian royal seat. This attack on Persian territory was a direct challenge to Darius's authority. The great king vowed revenge and, according to legend, commanded a servant to remind him 3 times before every meal, Master, remember the Athenians. The Ionian revolt was ultimately crushed by 494 BCE, with Miletus destroyed and its population enslaved. But Athens' participation in the rebellion provided Darius with a pretext, and from the Persian perspective, a legitimate cause, to launch a punitive expedition against mainland Greece. In 490 BCE, a Persian fleet carrying 25,000 soldiers crossed the Aegean and landed at Marathon, a coastal plain just 26 miles from Athens. The Athenians, led by the general Miltiades, marched out to meet them with approximately 10,000 hoplites, heavily armed infantry fighting in the phalanx formation. Outnumbered more than 2 to 1, the Athenians faced a tactical dilemma. Persian strength lay in their cavalry and archers, which could outflank and overwhelm a Greek infantry formation. But Miltiades noticed that the Persian cavalry was absent, possibly away foraging or already loaded back onto ships for an assault on an undefended Athens. Seizing the opportunity, the Athenians attacked. Miltiades extended his battle line to prevent encirclement, deliberately weakening his center while strengthening both wings. As the battle developed, the stronger Persian troops in the center pushed back the Greek middle, but the reinforced Greek wings enveloped the Persian flanks and attacked from behind. The Persian line collapsed, and soldiers fled in panic toward their ships. The Greeks pursued, slaughtering thousands in the surf. Marathon entered Greek legend as a miraculous victory. The messenger Pheidippides supposedly ran the 26 miles to Athens to announce the triumph before collapsing dead, a story that gave birth to the modern marathon race. But from a Persian perspective, Marathon was a minor frontier skirmish, barely worth noting. The expedition had been a reconnaissance in force, not a full invasion. Darius began preparing a much larger campaign, but his death in 486 BCE postponed the reckoning. His son Xerxes I inherited both the throne and the determination to punish Greece. But first, he had to crush rebellions in Egypt and Babylon, revolts that suggest the succession wasn't entirely smooth. By 480 BCE, Xerxes was ready. He assembled the largest military force the ancient world had ever seen, perhaps 180,000 troops, supported by over 1,000 warships. To transport this vast army from Asia to Europe, Persian engineers constructed a double pontoon bridge across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating the continents. When storms destroyed the first bridges, Xerxes allegedly ordered the waters whipped as punishment, a story Greek writers delighted in repeating as evidence of Persian tyranny. The Greek states, traditionally fragmented and hostile to one another, managed to assemble a defensive coalition led by Sparta and Athens. But many Greek cities either remained neutral or submitted to Persian rule without resistance. The odds seemed hopeless. The allied Greeks chose to make their first stand at Thermopylae, a narrow coastal pass where mountains descended almost to the sea, creating a bottleneck only 50 feet wide, the perfect terrain for hoplites to hold against superior numbers. King Leonidas of Sparta led the Greek force, his personal bodyguard of 300 Spartans, supplemented by several thousand other Greek troops. When Persian heralds demanded that the Greeks surrender their weapons, Leonidas reportedly replied with 2 words, "Come and take them." For 2 days, the Greeks held Thermopylae against wave after wave of Persian attacks. The narrow pass negated Xerxes' numerical advantage, forcing his troops to fight in confined spaces where Greek armor and discipline proved superior. The lightly armed Persian infantry, designed for mobile warfare in open terrain, couldn't break the bronze-clad phalanx. Even the Immortals, Xerxes' elite 10,000-man guard, failed to dislodge the defenders. But on the 3rd day, a Greek traitor named Ephialtes revealed to Xerxes a mountain path that bypassed Thermopylae. Persian troops, led by the Immortals, marched through the night and descended behind the Greek position. Realizing the position was lost, Leonidas dismissed most of his force, but chose to remain with his 300 Spartans and a few hundred Thespians and Thebans. Buying time for the rest to escape, they fought to the last man. Thermopylae was a tactical defeat, but a strategic and morale victory. The 3-day delay had disrupted Xerxes' timetable and allowed the Greeks to evacuate Athens and concentrate their forces. More importantly, the heroic stand demonstrated that Persians could be resisted, that overwhelming force could be challenged by courage and discipline. With Thermopylae fallen, Xerxes advanced into Attica. The population of Athens had been evacuated to the island of Salamis and the Peloponnese. Persian soldiers entered an empty city and burned it to the ground, revenge for the burning of Sardis a decade earlier. But the war was far from over. The Greek fleet, led by the Athenian Themistocles, had retreated to the narrow straits near Salamis. Themistocles understood that the Persian navy's numerical advantage would be nullified in confined waters. Through a combination of deception and tactical brilliance, he lured the Persian fleet into the narrow straits. The resulting naval battle became one of history's decisive engagements. Greek triremes, more maneuverable in tight quarters, rammed and disabled Persian ships that became entangled with each other in the chaos. Xerxes watched from a throne erected on a hillside as his fleet was destroyed. The Battle of Salamis changed everything. Without naval superiority, Xerxes couldn't supply his massive army through the winter. Fearing that the Greeks might destroy his bridges over the Hellespont and trap him in Europe, he retreated to Asia with most of his forces, leaving behind his general Mardonius with a smaller army to continue the campaign. The following year, at the Battle of Plataea, the largest hoplite army ever assembled crushed the remaining Persian forces. Greece's independence was secured. The Persian wars would drag on intermittently for decades, but the great invasions were over. Persia would never again threaten mainland Greece. The failure damaged Persian prestige and proved that the empire, for all its vastness and wealth, was not invincible. It also sparked a golden age in Athens, as confidence from victory fueled the cultural and intellectual achievements of Pericles' era. The stage was set for an eventual reversal of fortunes, though it would take a century and a half before a Greek-speaking king would march east to conquer the Persian heartland. The defeats in Greece exposed vulnerabilities in the Achaemenid system. The empire's sheer size created communication problems that even the royal road couldn't entirely solve. Satraps in distant provinces exercised considerable autonomy, and as central authority weakened under less capable successors, some began to act like independent kings. After Xerxes' assassination in 465 BCE, murdered by the commander of his royal bodyguard, a series of succession crises plagued the dynasty. Artaxerxes I spent the early years of his reign crushing rebellions in Egypt and Bactria. His successors faced constant challenges from ambitious relatives and restive provinces. The Great Satraps Revolt of the 360s BCE saw multiple western provinces rise in coordinated rebellion. And though it was eventually suppressed, the episode demonstrated that imperial unity could no longer be taken for granted. Egypt proved particularly troublesome, successfully rebelling and maintaining independence from 404 to 343 BCE before being reconquered. Each rebellion drained the treasury and required military campaigns that stretched imperial resources. The financial strain led to increased taxation, which created resentment and further instability. Succession disputes multiplied as the royal family grew, and various factions competed for the throne. Assassinations and palace coups became common. The legitimacy that Darius had worked so hard to establish through the Behistun inscription and monumental architecture gradually eroded. By the time Darius III ascended the throne in 336 BCE, the empire he inherited was still vast, still wealthy, but increasingly hollow at its core. The same year, Darius III became Great King of Persia. A 20-year-old prince inherited the throne of Macedonia in the backwater northern reaches of Greece. His name was Alexander, and he would accomplish in 12 years what had seemed impossible: the complete conquest of the Persian Empire. Alexander III inherited more than a throne from his father, Philip II. He inherited a military machine unlike anything the ancient world had seen. The Macedonian phalanx combined the discipline of Greek hoplites with greater flexibility and offensive power. Macedonian cavalry, drawn from the nobility, formed an elite strike force capable of decisive charges. Supporting units of archers, javelin throwers, and siege engineers provided combined arms capabilities that gave Macedonian armies tactical superiority on virtually any battlefield. But Alexander brought something Philip had lacked: genius, ambition, and a sense of destiny that bordered on divine self-belief. Tutored by Aristotle, steeped in Homer's epics, Alexander saw himself as a new Achilles destined for immortal glory. When he crossed the Hellespont into Asia in 334 BCE with 48,000 men, he was invading, not just to avenge the Persian wars of the previous century, that was merely propaganda, but to conquer the known world. The first confrontation came at the Granicus River, where Persian satraps had assembled an army to stop the invaders at the water's edge. Alexander personally led the cavalry charge across the river, nearly dying in the initial assault when a Persian commander struck at him with a sword, only to be killed by one of Alexander's companions. The Battle of Granicus was a Macedonian victory, but its true significance lay in what followed. Alexander's policy toward conquered territory. He freed the Greek cities of Asia Minor from Persian rule, abolished tyrannies, and portrayed himself as a liberator rather than a conqueror. Persian satraps who surrendered were often left in office. Treasuries were seized, but populations spared. This clemency wouldn't last. In 333 BCE, at Issus, Alexander faced Darius III himself for the first time. The Persian king had assembled a massive army in Syria, confident that sheer numbers would crush the Macedonian upstart. But Darius made a fatal tactical error by accepting battle in a narrow coastal plain that negated his numerical advantage. Alexander, employing the combined arms tactics that had become his signature, feinted with his right wing to draw Persian forces out of position, then launched a devastating cavalry charge directly at Darius's position in the center. The Persian king, seeing the Macedonians cutting through his guard and, with his chariot horses wounded and panicking, fled the battlefield. His army, seeing their monarch retreat, collapsed in panic. Darius offered peace after Issus, proposing to cede everything west of the Euphrates River and pay an enormous ransom for his family, who had been captured by Alexander. Alexander's general Parmenion counseled acceptance, noting that he would accept such terms if I were Alexander. Alexander's famous reply, "So would I, if I were Parmenion." The young king wanted not half of the Persian Empire, but all of it. Alexander spent the next 2 years securing the empire's western and southern provinces. He conquered the Phoenician cities, breaking Persian naval power in the Mediterranean. He marched into Egypt, where he was crowned pharaoh and founded the city of Alexandria. By 331 BCE, he was ready for the decisive confrontation. Darius chose the battlefield carefully this time. The plains of Gaugamela in northern Mesopotamia, where his cavalry and chariots would have room to maneuver. He assembled perhaps the largest army in Persian history. Ancient sources claim millions, though modern historians estimate closer to 100,000, including elephants from India and scythed chariots designed to tear through infantry formations. The Persians even leveled the ground ahead of time to give their chariots a clear run. On October 1st, 331 BCE, the two armies met in the pre-dawn darkness. Alexander's 47,000 troops faced perhaps twice their number arrayed across a front several miles wide. Darius positioned himself in the center, surrounded by his best troops. Alexander, as always, commanded his cavalry on the right wing. The battle began with the Persian chariots charging the Macedonian line. But Alexander's light infantry, archers and javelin throwers positioned in front of the phalanx, opened lanes in their formation, allowing the chariots to pass harmlessly through while raining missiles on the drivers. Those chariots that reached the phalanx found themselves unable to break the overlapping shields and protruding spears. As the battle developed, Alexander noticed a gap opening in the Persian center, as cavalry from their left wing attempted to envelop the Macedonian right. In one of history's most decisive moments, Alexander led his companion cavalry in a wedge formation straight at this gap, driving directly toward Darius's position. The shock was devastating. Persian guards surrounding the great king were cut down or scattered. Darius, his nerve breaking, turned his chariot and fled again. The sight of their king retreating demoralized the entire Persian army, which began to disintegrate, despite having the advantage in multiple sectors of the battlefield. Gaugamela was decisive not because of casualties, though Persian losses were staggering, but because it shattered the myth of Persian invincibility and broke the will of the empire to resist. Babylon opened its gates without a fight, Susa surrendered its treasures, gold and silver worth perhaps 50,000 talents, an almost incomprehensible sum. In January 330 BCE, Alexander's army approached Persepolis. The symbolism of Persepolis's fall cannot be overstated. For nearly 2 centuries, it had embodied Achaemenid power and glory. Alexander allowed his troops to plunder the city for days. Contemporary accounts speak of gold and silver being hauled away by the wagon load, of treasures accumulated over generations being melted down or scattered. Then, either in a drunken celebration or as deliberate policy, sources differ, Persepolis was burned. The cedar roofs caught fire, the paint on the columns bubbled and blackened, and the great audience halls collapsed. The symbolic heart of the Persian Empire was reduced to smoke and ash. Darius III, now a fugitive king, fled east with what remained of his forces. But in the summer of 330 BCE, his own satrap Bessus, the governor of Bactria, murdered him to prevent his surrender to Alexander, and declared himself the new great king. The assassination ended the Achaemenid dynasty's legitimate line. Alexander, claiming to be Darius's avenger, hunted down Bessus and executed him. The young Macedonian king now controlled the Persian Empire in its entirety. The Achaemenid Empire fell, but its legacy proved far more durable than its armies. Alexander kept the satrap system largely intact, recognizing its administrative brilliance. Many Persian officials remained in office under Macedonian rule. The royal road continued to function. The bureaucracy that Darius had created remained operational because it worked, better than anything Alexander could devise to replace it. In this sense, Alexander became not the destroyer of the Persian Empire, but its inheritor. The cultural synthesis that followed would define the Hellenistic period. Greek and Persian traditions merged, creating hybrid art forms, religious syncretism, and new philosophical schools. Alexander himself adopted Persian court ceremonial, married Persian noblewomen, and encouraged his soldiers to do likewise. His vision, cut short by his death at 32 in 323 BCE, was of a unified empire where Greek and Persian elites would form a new ruling class. The successor kingdoms that emerged from Alexander's fragmentary empire, the Seleucids in Syria and Mesopotamia, the Ptolemies in Egypt, all borrowed heavily from Achaemenid administrative practices. The Roman Empire, encountering Persian organizational methods through these Hellenistic states, adopted many innovations, including provincial governance systems remarkably similar to satrapies, extensive road networks, and postal services. The Parthians and Sasanians, later Persian dynasties, explicitly claimed Achaemenid heritage and attempted to restore Persian greatness. But perhaps the Achaemenid Empire's greatest achievement lay in its demonstration that diverse peoples could be governed without forced cultural assimilation. The policy of tolerance that Cyrus pioneered, allowing conquered peoples to maintain their traditions while contributing to imperial prosperity, offered an alternative to the brutal subjugation practiced by earlier empires like Assyria. This model influenced not just Alexander, but every subsequent empire that sought to rule multicultural populations, from Rome to the Caliphates to the Ottomans. Modern Iran has embraced Cyrus the Great as a national hero. His Pasargadae tomb, a pilgrimage site, the Cyrus Cylinder, is celebrated as an early declaration of human rights, though scholars debate whether its principles reflected genuine Achaemenid values or pragmatic propaganda. What's undeniable is that the Achaemenid vision of a universal empire embracing multiple cultures resonates powerfully in our interconnected world. The roads they built, the postal systems they invented, the administrative innovations they pioneered, the architectural splendors they created, these outlasted the dynasty itself. When Persepolis burned, the empire fell, but the idea of what that empire represented, order, prosperity, tolerance, the possibility of unity and diversity, survived to inspire and challenge future generations. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Achaemenid Persian Empire, consider subscribing to History Scrolls TV for more stories that bring the ancient world to life. Hit that like button, leave a comment with your thoughts on Persian versus Greek civilization, And stay tuned for our next journey through history's greatest civilizations.